just as Shiva beholds the turning of Shakti, right? So in contemplative practices like yoga, like meditation, and pranayama, right? We are holding space for the process by which the mind asks itself this question, who am I? And then starts creating itself in response. Because everything that we experience is some dimension of that very process. So when we first started talking about Kundalini some weeks ago, we noted that Kundalini represents something that is relevant to us all. Kundalini represents our basic vitality, our basic creative energy, as well as the intelligence that oversees our psychological development. And her journey through the hollow center of the body, from the pelvic floor to the crown, her union with Shiva, her beloved, downpour of the soma, or the lunar rain, is itself a metaphor for a process of gradual, cyclical, and indeed often quite ordinary and familiar awakening. That indeed the rising of Kundalini just is the rising of spirit, and that the drama of her ascent is nothing less than, if sometimes more, than the ordinary drama of our lives. That our biographies, our emotional biographies, our spiritual biographies, are indeed the stories of our lives are the stories of her often blistering longing, and her approach, and her occasional trysting and subsequent estrangement from her beloved. And so we came to appreciate in that, in that first week that Kundalini doesn't represent something esoteric, because she's not an energy that we use yoga to call down into us. She's not something that stands outside of us. She's not something that we have to somehow credential ourselves in order to contact. She's not something that we need to even very strongly educate ourselves before we can start to approach her, but that rather we are always already in relationship with her, and that we symbolize her to ourselves in uncountably many different ways. But that yoga is about bringing us back into communion with her if we have become estranged. And indeed, we find ourselves very often in a state of estrangement from all that she represents. Okay? Now, in the second talk was more oriented toward understanding why it is that the story of Kundalini, the myth of Kundalini, is at heart a love story, right? It's a story about erotic love, in fact, because the way that Kundalini is understood traditionally in Hatha Yoga is according to these metaphors of erotic longing, that what makes Kundalini stir and what makes her rise through the hollow center of the body is her erotic desire for union with her beloved, her erotic desire to reveal her sensuous aspect to the adoring light of awareness. Okay. And we also, in the second talk, in order to understand why this metaphor is fundamentally erotic, we also talked about the background sort of cosmological picture that's implied by this metaphor. Or at least a sort of background cosmological picture that you find in many of the philosophical and spiritual traditions that center this myth of Kundalini. And the basic idea, because it's really important to have it before us again with some clarity before we proceed, is something like this. That at the very heart of things, at the heart of your being, and by extension, at the very heart of the phenomenal world, there's a consciousness that knows nothing outside of itself, has no sense of a division between what's inside of it and outside of it. That in its most fundamental nature has no existential anxiety about what it is untouched by sorrow, is untouched by grief, is untouched by agony, unrippled by pain, but that simply abides within itself. But then some part of it eventually asks itself a question. And that question is, who am I? And then the same part starts to create the world in response to the question. The same part of you starts to create images of who you are, right? Starting at a very young age. Probably about the time that your memories begin, at least the memories that you can weave into your story in some meaningful way. Right about that time in your life, you start to project ideas of who you are, precisely to weave them into a kind of ongoing narrative of what's happening to you, and in order to help make sense of it. Now, the part of yourself that asks the question, who am I? And the part of yourself that starts answering or creating in response is the same part. Okay? And in the conceptual scheme of Shiva and Shakti, it's the Shakti part. Mm-hmm. Because Shakti is all creative dynamism. She's also the power of speech, right? And indeed it's said that she creates the world through that very power. Mm-hmm. Now I started to tell you a few weeks back a little piece of lore about how Patanjali got his name. And In fact, Patanjali is considered to be an avatar of Anantashesha. Anantashesha is the serpent of infinity, and his name literally means Shesha without limit. And Shesha means the remainder. So Shesha is everything that's left over after a particular ritual has been performed, or, after something's been constructed, something's been assembled, something's been drawn together out of some store of materials. And the idea is that there's still materials left behind. Right? Or that something's been revealed because something makes an appearance, and in that way shows the nature of what it's made of, but shows it in a limited way, in a finite way, and in an incomplete way, because there are infinitely more appearances that could be constructed out of that same material. And the real nature of that material couldn't possibly be fully revealed unless all of its many sides, which happen to be infinite, are revealed. Okay. And so Anantashesha represents all of the aspects of, for example, the goddess that haven't been revealed. Right? And that's why his name is the infinite remainder. Right? Everything that's left out of the mandala of experience as you know it. Right? And there's a sense in which the mandala of your experience is always sort of pointing to something that's beyond itself, always hinting at the presence of something that stands behind what it is that you experience, that seems to be somehow brought forward, somehow revealed, but always in a kind of veiled and incomplete way. Yeah? So I just want to illustrate that idea a little bit further with this piece of lore that we studied, with which many of you are somewhat familiar. So Anantashesha, according to the lore, was slithering through the reeds, and he came into a clearing where he heard Shiva and Shakti. And Shakti was asking Shiva to recount to her the secrets of yoga. And so Anantashesha got very excited and coiled up and listened closely as Shiva, the divine patron of yoga, spilled all of the secrets, supposedly, to Shakti. But Anantashesha, see, he's been around forever, right? He doesn't have a creation story because he's part of Prakriti, the sort of fundamental ground of materiality and creative dynamism. So he's been around forever. Stuff is given a creation story out of the fund of material whose expressed part he represents. Okay. So he's been around long enough to know that when Shakti asks Shiva to recount the secrets of yoga, she's not asking him to illuminate her. She's not asking him to tell him something that she doesn't already know, because she's the embodiment of the intelligence and the animating force behind the yogic process, right? She's the intelligence that oversees all psychological development, right? And so she knows the yoga through and through, in a sense, right? Or she's the embodiment of that wisdom. But many of the tantras have this form where Shakti asks Shiva a question that she must in some sense already know the answer to because she is the embodiment of that knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so when she stands before Shiva and she asks him to elaborate a certain dimension of her fundamental nature, she's really standing before her beloved, right? Sort of playfully, and saying, tell me what you see. Right? And the traditional metaphor is that Shiva is her mirror, you see. Because in fact, and that's a rich metaphor, Shiva as the mirror, because indeed, there's a certain sense in which without Shakti, Shiva's totally inert. Because Shakti is his power of speech. Shakti is his animating principle. Right? And so when Shiva dances, and if you look just above my finger there, there's a dancing Shiva up there on the mantle above. But that dancing Shiva is a symbol of Shakti, of the creative principle dancing through the space of consciousness. Because Shiva himself just represents the space within which Shakti can unfold her creative power, right? So there's a certain sense in which Shakti's question, tell me the secrets of yoga, or tell me what you see, right, is a kind of inflection of the question that she's asking herself, who am I, right? And she has to pose that question to Shiva because she has to pose that question into the space of consciousness so that that question can be heard at all. You see what I mean? Unless she poses it there, the question's never asked in the first place, right? Because just to remind, the idea is that Shiva and Shakti are just two dimensions of that same profundity of consciousness, with Shiva being the sort of the quality of spaciousness within it, and so the principle of sentience, and Shakti being the creative dynamism. Right? And the idea is that those two principles are inseparable from one another. Because only creative dynamism can expand and contract the space of consciousness so that there can be space in some meaningful sense. She has to dance within that space in order for there to be a space of consciousness, because without her, there's nothing for consciousness to be of. And consciousness is always of something. Right? And without him opening space for her to unfold her creative principle, there's no room for her to do that. She can't ask her question except in the space of sentience. And so, in a fundamental sense, Shakti standing before Shiva and saying, like asking herself this question, who am I? And then looking in the mirror and seeing her own reflection, because she's listening to her own answer through his power of speech, right? But perhaps coming back to her in a way that she wouldn't otherwise be able to see, right? Like you've got to stand before the mirror in order to see certain sides of yourself. So she's standing before the mirror and she turns and turns, and every time she turns, she reveals another aspect of herself, right? And so Shiva is watching this. It's as if Shiva's there giving the discourse, right? He's the one going on and on, right? But in a certain sense, he's just the mirror of her turning. But the way that Shiva and Shakti relate, to remind again, is that Shiva holds space for all that Shakti reveals, and he adores every revelation of her nature that she makes. Shiva has no narrative self-reference point. He has no idea of himself in relation to which he could see any of her revelations as threatening. He has no creation story, a lot like Anantashesha, right? So he has no sort of narrative self-image, and without a narrative self-image, nothing really seems threatening, right? And so he doesn't recoil from any aspect of her, but he also doesn't grasp at any aspect of her, right? Because he has no agenda with respect to her. And because of that, he holds this wide open space that he never brooks any resistance to anything that she reveals or any way that she wants to move. Okay? And that brings us to the dimension of this dynamic that I wanted us to focus on more directly in this meeting, which is how we relate in the context of practice to this energy of Kundalini. And before we step further in that, I want to point out that in regard to Shakti's question, who am I? Tell me what you see. Reveal to me the secrets of yoga. Shiva, from his side, holds the question itself perennially open. So he never forms an idea of who Shakti is that he uses to pretend that the question's been brought to a close. You see what I mean? So he never looks at Shakti and goes, now I know who you are. I've got you. You ask, who are you? And then you show me all this. Well, I've seen your dance. I know who you are. You see what I mean? Which would be a nasty thing to do. Although it turns out, on reflection, that we do it to ourselves all the time. And that indeed, traditionally in yoga, that's one way of pointing out the fundamental source of suffering. Okay. But Shiva, in holding space for her to always reveal another side of herself, is as if he's holding open the question of who she is. And he's fascinated by the question, right? She poses this question and then he goes, and so he's listening, he's watching, right? He's feeling. He's the awareness that operates through all of the senses to behold the sensuous aspect of the goddess, right? So the mirror metaphor is a little limiting because it just implies that he's looking, right? But he's not just looking. He's smelling her fragrance. He's feeling the texture of her being, right? He's listening to the humming and the whirring and all of the different sounds that she makes as she turns, right? And tasting all of her various flavors continuously as she reveals them, because, and he always does it with the kind of wonder that one feels just as one poses a very genuine and essential existential question, right? And I'm reminded as I say that of how Aristotle said that philosophy is born from a sense of wonder, right? And indeed, when it loses that sense of wonder, it becomes very dry and brittle. Right? Because a consciousness that's suffused with wonder is totally open to whatever might actually reveal itself. It's not so much expecting to find anything, and because it has no expectation, because it has no particular agenda in finding this rather than that, right? It's wide open to receiving what actually appears, right? And so refrains from the nasty business of projecting an idea of what appears and then reducing the other to that idea, right? And regarding her as if she were nothing more than that idea foretells. And perhaps being disturbed, or at worst, even punishing her, however subtly, when she fails to conform to that image, right? Which again, according to yoga psychology and according to your simple reflections on yourself, I think you'll find that that's something that we do to ourselves all the time. Yeah? And to each other. So, but if the fundamental metaphor, right, as we saw last time, of Hatha Yoga is this erotic entanglement of Shiva and Shakti, right? And if that erotic entanglement itself, as I told you, has no agenda, has no culminating moment, no peak experience that brings it to an end, right? Then instead, the yoga itself is meant to be the continuous opening of this space of wonder-filled consciousness to the spontaneous outpouring of the creative principle. And what comes forward in that, when Shiva holds space for Shakti to reveal herself, what comes forward is something excessive, exceedingly complex, right? But also something that has its own coherence, its own force, its own direction, its own intelligence, and its own tremendous vibrance. And that's important to remind ourselves. That's something of which it's important to remind ourselves because we forget. The part of our minds that keeps projecting an idea of who we are and then trying to force ourselves to conform to that image on pain of shame, embarrassment, frustration, and all the rest of it, sorrow, loneliness. That part of ourselves thinks that, and this isn't just the Shakti part, this is the sort of ego-centered, this is the part of ourselves that is anxious to identify with a particular narrative, with a particular self-image. And because it is, that part of ourself distracts us away from the broader movement of the creative energy inside us, and so dramatically limits our experience of it and so of who we are. Yeah? And that part thinks that unless we conform to some image that it has of who we should be, that the result would be some kind of chaos or incoherence or darkness, In other words, if I were just to really relax and just let my deeper impulses come forward, my God, who would I be? What would I do? Right? Because there's a side of me that's afraid of what those deeper impulses might be like, because I hold them in my shadow, so they seem so dark and unpredictable. You see what I mean? And that's a kind of lack, and then that kind of lack of trust then prevents me from a kind of wider opening of the space of my awareness, and within which the real yoga could start to unfold, right? Within which that deeper creative energy could simply, unravel those psychical knots and manifest itself as it will, which is always unpredictable, right? And again, always excessive. Excessive in the following sense, that it will always, that those revelations of the creative principle will always spill over the boundaries of any of my attempts to understand what it actually is or where exactly it's going, right? That doesn't mean I can't see what it is and see where it's going in the way that Shiva sees Shakti in the moment. In fact, he sees her better than, she sees her as well as she could possibly be seen, right? He's the very sort of apotheosis of clear seeing, right? And of clear experience, right? In fact, only he sees her as she is, but he never sees her definitively, because he never forms an idea of her on the basis of appearances that he then projects or imposes onto his experience, right? To limit all of the other sides of herself that she might be trying to show. Okay? Precisely what he doesn't do. And so this question, who am I, is the question that, indeed the part of ourselves that asks the question and starts creating all of our different images of ourselves in response. Is itself what we behold in contemplative practice. Just as Shiva beholds the turning of Shakti, right? So in contemplative practices like yoga, like meditation, like pranayama, right? We are holding space for the process by which the mind asks itself this question, who am I? And then starts creating itself in response. Right? Because everything that we experience when we experience ourselves is some dimension of that very process. And the yoga is about holding that process in a wider and wider space, in a wider and wider view, right? And that means suspending, so among other things, and this is where this is sort of the practical thrust of this reflection, is that we are softening into a wider space in which we can allow deeper dimensions of our being to be revealed to us without any preconception about what's going to be revealed or how that's going to impact us when it is revealed, right? And that means doing something that on the one hand is totally natural, and on the other hand is exceedingly rare. Right? You with me? Natural because it means that you're doing nothing more than holding that very natural, indeed sort of a very natural sense of wonder-filled awareness for the creative principle to reveal itself through you. And exceedingly rare because the way that we normally operate is very different from that. Right? So one of the things that we want to see is the way that in our practices of asana, pranayama, meditation, other related things that we might do, the way that we reflect on ourselves, even in doing what we're doing right now. The way that we project a certain idea of the kinds of feelings and experiences that we're trying to induce through these practices, and then try to manipulate our prana, manipulate the spaces of our awareness to arrange for those experiences, right? It's a common thing to fall into, and yet it's precisely the kind of thing that limits us and prevents us from having deeper intimacy with the creative force as it's ready to express itself through us. And the answer is not to resist that tendency and to resist that impulse, because that would only embroil us in the very same pattern, right? Of again trying to manipulate and control our experience in order to bring it into an alignment with a certain idea of what we should be doing or how our practice should unfold. Do you see what I mean? And so what we do instead is try to hold all of those movements of our minds together with all of the assessments that we keep making of ourselves, right? All the condemnations, right? Or perhaps occasional moments of praise, to hold all of those assessments in this wider, more open, more wonder-filled, and indeed more loving space of awareness. Right? Now that does indeed take I think as a sort of prerequisite, a certain trust, right? Shraddha, as what Patanjali called Shraddha. And that Shraddha is profoundly, it's one of the sort of two fundamental elements of opening, the other being sort of the act of opening itself. But Shraddha is different from hope if hope has as its object a certain state of affairs. Right? I hope that, right? Or let's say faith, in the sense of believing that such and such will transpire if I let go. So in other words, if I let go, if I sort of, open myself to deeper dimensions of my being, knowing that when I do that, things that I've hidden from myself in my shadows are going to come to light, and that's going to force some kind of reorganization of my sense of who I am, both internally and externally. And if I think that if there's some particular result, some particular idea of how that's going to go down that I'm guided by, then that's not trust. That's projecting another idea, right? And then going about trying to manipulate my experience to make it conform with that idea. You see what I mean? So trust doesn't have an object in that way, or shraddha in this yogic sense. It doesn't have an object in that way. It doesn't have a certain state of affairs as its aim that, it believes or has faith or hopes that will be brought about or initiated through that act of surrender, right? It's rather simply a kind of readiness, right? An openness to letting go. So it's something that you enact in a way, right? But not intentionally and not for the sake of bringing out a certain end, right? But perhaps simply because you see and understand the way that you otherwise limit your experience and distort your fuller creative expression, or the way that you interfere with the natural unfolding of your karmic situation. So the idea could be that in trusting, there's a sort of openness to finding out what you are, knowing that finding out what you are is going to catalyze some kind of perhaps rather far-reaching reorganization of your experience. And being open to it anyways, simply because you're clear about your fundamental desire to be open to and fully present with the spontaneous revelation of those deeper aspects of your being. In other words, if you have clarity about what the fundamental desire of your heart is, if you feel that longing for intimacy with what's real, right? If you feel a longing to step out of the delusions, the space of delusion in which you ordinarily confine yourself, then your yoga practice, the spirit in which you practice, the approach that you take when you practice may be radically different. Because you understand, for example, that you can't force Kundalini to surge for you to help you realize your spiritual fantasies. You see what I mean? But you see that that's all a game of the mind. Right? You see that all of your spiritual fantasies and all of the effort that you expend in trying to realize those fantasies is just another iteration of the same old game that the mind's been playing since before you were a teenager, right? And so you don't see the yogic practice as a vehicle for your effort, right? But rather as a space in which you can taste the intensity of your longing for intimacy with the creative principle and understand that in tasting that intensity, you are already entering a space of profound and deep connection with the same. You see what I mean? And that when you enter that space, you're sort of inviting, you're holding space for the creative principle to reveal more of itself through you without any preconception of what might result. And in that way, you're engaged in a very sweet and clear devotional act of reverence for the creative force. And so the practice just simply becomes an expression of your devotion. And in that way, an act of genuine participation in the self-contemplation of the profundity. Because in simply holding space for yourself, in holding space for these more tender aspects of your own emotional body to be revealed, right? You are, like Shiva, holding space for Shakti to reveal her otherwise unseen and hidden aspects.